Plan text. The United States federal government should substantially increase its oversight of state and municipal utilities by establishing a review board to enforce National Institute standards and technology cybersecurity standards framework compliance nationwide. The United States federal government should substantially increase its oversight of state and municipal utilities by establishing a review board to enforce National Institute standards and technology cybersecurity standards framework compliance nationwide. Thank you. Of course. Attention one, cybersecurity. Subpoint A is that utilities are vulnerable to the status quo. The first argument is standards. The agency point is that the CBO report has indicated that hacking is that these utilities that we have, like federal power plants and chemical water safety plants, are not very well regulated and aren't regulated to protect them against hacking. The BC point is that there are also physical vulnerabilities within the chemical and nuclear power plants that are not sufficiently secured against attackers. The second argument is that there are the second argument is division. The agency point is that there are that the devolving of the requirements of states and municipalities has allowed for thousands of different outlets and security mechanisms and regimes to be able to regulate the particular ways in which the cybersecurity is enforced, which means that there's not a standard of current establishment of nationwide standards for cybersecurity. The third argument is that attacks are coming. The agency point is that military reports have found that Al Qaeda and the Islamic State have computers with surveys of the United States grid system to be able to identify the vulnerabilities, to be able to launch comprehensive cyber attacks. The agency point, there was an attempt at physical attack in California last week to indicate that there needs to be more standards against these kinds of physical attacks. The agency point studies the DoD experts have decided that a cyber Pearl Harbor is coming within the next couple of years as a result of the international community engaging in more cyber espionage and against Nazi actors attempting to attack the United States grid. The beast point of plans also. The first one is the IDCT framework is established to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover from key technological innovations. Key technological innovations. This allows for the affirmative to be able to solve back forward any kinds of hacking that would happen on these critical utilities. The federal government doesn't require that these states and municipalities implement them uniformly across the board. It's for utility use, which means that the plan is necessarily critical. The second argument is perception. The people who are trying to attack the United States are looking for easy inroads. They're not looking for the most secure parts of the grid, which means that the ability for the United States to have the perception that they are increasing their security standards would mean that they would start to look elsewhere for other ways to attack the United States. The third framework is the compliance boards would be able to cycle through employees and also enforce regulatory standards based on determining whether or not leadership was leading for properly through the standards on those particular utilities. This would reduce vulnerabilities and prevent hacking in the future. The fourth argument is also that the United States is often models on its security policy. The United States, as they would cooperate with other countries like India that have massive cybersecurity problems because the amount of software that they produce indicates that they would be able to model the cybersecurity frameworks. So the international community allows for rules of engagement to ultimately be established because the United States becomes a leader in what cybersecurity ought to be implemented nationwide. The cease point is the impacts. The first is meltdowns. The agency point is that the United States has over 200 power plants, 200 nuclear reactors inside the United States that are concentrated on the East Coast, which indicates that we are vulnerable right now because they're so geographically consolidated. The agency point is that they would be a massive cascading meltdown as a result of attack, as a result of cyber attack that would hit one single power plant. MIT did a study that indicates that the grid is so interconnected in those regions that indicates that if a single power plant were to go down, it wouldn't be like Fukushima, but rather Fukushima times 200. The agency point is that ultimately causes extinction of the radiation. As a result of the meltdowns would ultimately get caught up in jet streams inside the United States to spread global agriculture. The difference is that it won't be as geographically isolated as 3 Mile Island or Japan was, an indication that the massive amount of meltdowns would ultimately cause extinction. The decent point is that there's also that this protects against biological warfare against against the water power plants because it would establish cybersecurity standards of getting rid of their physical security, meaning that they couldn't be easily bypassed, which means that we'd be able to prevent against biological terrorism. The decent point is that biological terrorism will also cause extinction because it spreads disease through the water supply too easily, which means that it would ultimately be designed and evolved in order to be able to kill people faster. That means that you should prepare this impact. The exit point is that it will also collapse the economy. The more cyber hacks that happen inside the United States, the less people want to engage financially, specifically with credit cards, debit cards, and other forms of electronic communication, which is the primary way in which trade and global integration economically happens, which means that it will ultimately collapse growth in the United States because people won't want to trade with us anymore. The exit point is that growth is a impact filter. It allows for individuals to have economic independence. That means that they won't go to war with one another because they find that there are economic benefits not being ultimately that are not economic benefits not going to war. That would prevent resource wars because we can able to trade for resources that ultimately prevents extinction because we wouldn't have to launch nuclear weapons against other countries. When everyone would run out of resources, we would simply be able to trade for them. Then nuclear war causes extinction. The second impact is warming. The ace point is that hacks of nuclear power plants ultimately prevent any kind of investment because those economic investors who are looking for secure, different kinds of renewable energy to invest in would not want to go toward nuclear power plants because of the Fukushima stigma. The beast point is that the affirmative plan will allow absolute cybersecurity standards to ultimately give investors confidence in the way in which they can invest. That means that there would be any kind of power plants where they would lose all of their money. The beast point is that expansion of nuclear power plants is necessarily critical to be able to solve back for warming because it allows for carbon negative technology to be implemented that would prevent continued carbon dioxide explosions into the atmosphere. The beast point is that we're already at 450 parts per million in the NOAA has identified 480 parts per million as the point of no return, whereby cycles of warming will continue to heat up the planet, ultimately cause extinction for two reasons. The first reason that will cause extinction is because of the ocean. The ocean is actually a massive carbon sink, and it takes about half the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and acidifies the ocean. This ultimately kills off breeding grounds that are critical for fish species and other biodiversity like phytoplankton and in the form of coral reefs. This means that phytoplankton would ultimately be killed off because it causes a cascading effect, because biodiversity is reliant on other kinds of earth life, which means that extinction would ultimately happen because phytoplankton is the only way we get access to our ability to be able to breathe, because that's where 80% of our oxygen comes from. The ESA point is also nuclear diversity, means that we won't have any oil dependency anymore. The United States' ability to have a massive amount of oil production inside the United States and a diversified energy production system where nuclear power plants are able to expand across the different parts of the country means they would have to no longer import any more of their oil. The ESA point under this is that this decreases our reliance on our Middle Eastern allies and ultimately frees the United States from having to continually intervene in the Middle East. This has two impacts. The first is hegemony. We don't have any overstretch militarily when we are trying to pivot to Asia, but also attempting to create military operations inside the Middle East, like in places like Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen, is an indication that we would be able to have diversify the impact scenario. The hegemony ultimately is an impact filter as well, because it allows for the United States to be able to power broker in places like India and Pakistan, in areas where the regional tensions are only deterred by a massive superpower coming in and being able to solve the next scenarios. Also, it prevents terrorism. The United States has ultimately caused a massive amount of backlash because of the military operation that requires to go back to the Middle East, and they're perceived as imperialist because they're constantly trying to get access to the oil absent and oil dependency. These military operations would no longer be necessary, which means there would be less backlash in the future. The next scenario, the impact of that is that terrorism ultimately would be able to spread much further. If the United States military got too overstretched, and it wouldn't spread as much because we wouldn't have to go into the Middle East, and they would be able to detonate fissile material. This ultimately results in escalation with other countries because it causes finger pointing back and forth between states as who would have detonated that particular bomb, and ultimately escalates to nuclear tensions, because we have high tension in the international community right now in places like Russia, where those individuals would point to us and say that we were the ones detonating all the bombs because we don't like other people, and that escalates to nuclear war because they can't compete with us in a ground war because we have a better military than them.
Cool. It's going to be two off. Then it's going to be the case. Honestly, just drop down to the impacts.
Is one of them long?
I mean, I don't think it's particularly long. I have it all in one sheet, but
So it's
it is a criticism. However you flow those.
Yeah, that's good. A little bit long.
Yeah, two off. Then impacts.
Alright.
Everybody good?
Good.
Cool. Judge is good.
First, we framework is the interpretation. We say that representations necessarily come first. Whatever circumstances that is fundamentally illusory. The plain text that we talk about in this round never leave this round. Additionally, there's no guarantee that any of us will ever go on to be policymakers. Probably indicates that this is never portable information that we ever take out of the round. This means the only question that we're relying upon in this round is the kind of orientations we have, because we will always engage rhetoric out of this round. Is we each of those rhetoric has force violence. This means this is most proximal for us in the rest of our lives, because it means that it affects everyone that we interact with. Unlike with those theory about policy making, meaning that this uniquely key and portable skill outside of parliament. It just as we would say that this is always prior question to policy, because rhetoric shapes the way that policies are formed, becomes justification to them, and under a democracy, the president has to make certain policy justifications to the masses to get appeals in the first place. Indicates even if we think policy is good, learning how to use rhetoric in specific ways, and the representation within that rhetoric is always going to be key. Thus, going to be the links. The first argument is going to be the plan text, the logic, securitization, the land, or this is going to be the uniform of securitization. Is not even just military securitization, but actually occurs on an ontological level. The land, or this is going to be specifically the way that you address the possibility of a threat. Never even identify a single individual actor who could be a threat, but rather as a hypothetical other who this is always in reference to and always in relation to. That will be under this. Even when they talk about the attack that happened, they don't actually isolate who did this, and there's no particular instances for breaking the status quo from particular countries. You make vague arguments about China to be in the past, but it's never going to be enough. They'll see under this. Always going to be this. It is always the logic that makes terms externalization of violence inevitable. It also means that there's terminal policy failure in a world where we can't even account for threats because we mystify them as a result of this logic. The next argument is that this understanding of the other always positions us oppositionally to them. You never understand the way that we relate to these potential threats in a way that would defuse the root cause of them, but rather within a responsive manner, which means that you always lose the ability to create genealogical account of where these threats occur in the first place. That's the impact. The first argument is that this makes militarization inevitable to the land. Specifically, is that this same logic that causes us to lash out in the first place. You would never be able to resolve any of your terrorism impacts in a world where this necessarily is the root cause of or example for this specifically is going to be that you will actually look at the Iraq War and the idea of this existential threat of weapons of mass destruction, never actually articulated or shown evidence for, and the idea of the unknown, which is the same idea as the unknown other that you articulate in this instance, which probably indicates that this is the same logic that justifies these wars in the first place. We would say that these wars would always outweigh the affirmative because there's no end point to this logic can always be expanded outwards, which probably means that it leads to imminent warfare and ultimately to the point of extinction. The next argument is going to be that this necessarily leads to purging of domestic groups and to genocide because we can always point fingers at them. The same as your finger pointing argument on domestic self. We say it's why fascism always looks for the easiest way out to point someone else and investigate and work against them. That's the alternative. It's vote negative as an act of vulnerability. Vote negative as an act of vulnerability. Solvency. What do you want?
Conditional.
It's conditional. Solvency. First argument under solvency is going to be that this is always able to resolve the affirmative because, always able to resolve the criticism because of the fact that it allows us to no longer securitize and steps outside of this just voting negative and choosing to say no to securitizing logic of the affirmative and choosing to reject those representations in this round is enough to get out of that vulnerability. You would always be able to check back because it allows us to get back to the actual root causes of these and to understand ourselves as precarious subjects. Arguments that is always going to be key because the actual cause of these wars and these problems that we resolve through militarism are always precarity. You can look at Butler's analysis of how the Iraq War happens through our ability to actually grieve and understand our own vulnerability and always just push back against this, which means that we could avoid the wars that lead to cybersecurity threats in the first place, which means that we resolve the affirmative. Next off, the uniqueness. The first argument is that Trump is going to lose primary in the status quo. The lay under this is going to be that Iowa is specifically indicative of this because of the fact that he fell behind Cruz, but in addition to this, we would all say this uniquely key because of the fact that his numbers have fallen after this, and currently in New Hampshire he's also behind, which indicates that moving to the fourth there has been an actual shift. The next argument is going to be there's also been established mobilization against Trump that is happening now with coalescing around Cruz and Rubio as the two backup candidates. Now the Carson's out of the question. The establishment is able to actually unify on this question. The next argument is that specifically you can look into the fact that he's fading the numbers in New Hampshire, which indicates that this is always going to be the unique moving away from this. Thus the links. The first argument is the GOP establishment is going to pass their plan, which is going to be problematic for a few reasons. Even if much of the GOP support base supports a strong military, supports things like strong security, they do not support overall federal regulation over things like resources and utilities. The little B under this is going to be you can look to the Bundy Group in Oregon specifically understands the action of the Bureau of Land Management within a broader context to regulate these utilities. The next argument is that we would always say this is always going to push back against rural communities who are always going to have more trouble implementing to the standards that the plan text requires, which necessarily means these voters would rally around someone who's not establishment to push back against this, and this is always going to be able to, let's see. Yeah, no, that's what we need. The next argument is that it's also going to make anger against the GOP and the Democrats increase because it's going to be seen as a GOP concession to the Democrats as well, which means that most of these conservative voters are just going to see this as the GOP establishment giving into the Democrats. That's the internal link. The first argument is that we say this means that Trump would be able to take the primary debate, the primary for a few reasons. The lay is that this means that in order to save face, the establishment would have to back off of Cruz and Rubio and actually back Trump as a result of this, which means, yeah, why not?
So, how is Trump not going to win the nom if he's going to win New Hampshire and South Carolina?
No arguments he's not going to win them. His numbers are behind after
How
Iowa.
is he not going to win?
We say the numbers are behind. We have that made. Next argument is that we specifically say that we say in a world where the GOP establishment changes to go behind Trump to save face on this and we're pulling their voters. That means that we necessarily get Trump on this question. But in addition to this, we just say that this also means that Trump will be able to overtake the establishment through just his rhetoric. Trump is particularly good at appealing to these voters and saying establishment Republicans are bad probably indicate that he would be able to shoot down Cruz and Rubio and get this. That means that we get a general election with Trump. We say that Trump will be able to beat Hillary for a few reasons. The first argument is that his understanding of hegemonic masculinity is highly appealing to the populace of the United States. That he has a number of cards he can pull in Hillary, including Benghazi emails and just generally opinion or speak probably indicates that rhetorically Trump, who's a master at rephrasing sentences in a way that appeal to people with lower education levels and higher levels of bigotry, probably is able to resolve for this better. But in addition to this, we would say that he would also beat Sanders because Sanders calls himself a fucking socialist, which probably means that he's unelectable in the first place. But in addition to this, we would say that Sanders just looks weak compared to Trump. So you just see a replay of what Trump and Bush looked like in the first place, and that's the impacts. The first argument is that Trump is going into the ability to solve global warming right now, or even specifically is that Trump has articulated that global warming is the lie that the Chinese are telling us to hold us behind on science development and energy development. This means that he would necessarily cut the entirety of the attempts to solve global warming right now. This turns the affirmative, but in addition to this, we would say Trump also would trigger a war with China because of the fact that he currently wants back trade tariffs on China and actually frame that on the market. Our market is that China is uniquely on the brink of the status quo because of what's happening in the South China Sea and because of Australian patrols moving into the region. China is particularly scared right now. The chance of a lash out increases as a result of this, and that would always lead to the kind of wars that you talk about. But in addition, we would say that this would just increase racism in the United States because he would build the wall as well as try to document Muslims in the United States, and that's foreign structural violence you should calculate. Go to the impacts. Alright. The first argument is they say meltdowns are always going to be problematic, and they say meltdowns are going to be problematic, and this is always going to lead to forms of econ collapse. This is that the econ collapse is never going to be the internal leak that you reach on this, and is also just been purely denied. Our argument for this specifically is going to be that cyber attacks that were able to infiltrate PayPal and MasterCard actually didn't stop the consumer spending that you indicated had no long-term effect on the econ, even when we were in a particularly precarious place coming out. The recession, which probably indicates that this form of cyber attack that makes consumer confidence go down is actually extremely low. But in addition to this, we would argue that there's never going to be a meltdown because in the status quo there is just a move away from these right now, which means go to the question of
move away from what?
We're moving away from nuclear energy right now. We'll say it's good. Go to the question of nuclear energy being good. They think nuclear energy is good because they will solve global warming. The first argument is that we can also solve global warming through better technology like algae biofuel, which is able to check back because of the fact that one, the Department of Defense is making billion-dollar investments in it because they want to be able to use it as jet fuel, but also the way that it's augmented into coal plants makes it a carbon sink because it's able to absorb carbon from coal production probably indicates that this checks back better, and you would necessarily trade off with that indigenous. We would say that nuclear energy is bad because mining from it always creates runoffs into the individual rivers that release toxins into those rivers for the long term and kill entire species. This means that biodiversity collapse becomes inevitable as a result of this, and you are never going to be able to resolve any of these questions. But in addition to this, we would say that you would never be able to solve the environment on the whole without carbon negative technology, which means biofuel would be uniquely key as long as we move towards things such as nuclear energy. There would always be a trade-off, and that means that we are simply too late on the question because of the fact that enough ice caps have already melted that we cannot have a rethawing, which means that this would necessarily make global warming inevitable. In addition to this, I think the design just turns it. All these terrorism arguments and criticisms, so we were able to resolve the root cause of terrorism better because we were able to articulate the way that we would be able to move and stop this through vulnerability. But in addition to this, we would always stop finger pointing, and this would get worse in a world of Trump, who just points the finger at everybody.
Yeah, straight down. Then the
That's not okay.
I don't know, which one are you gonna go for?
That's a good question.
You know, I'll do the criticism then I guess.
Cool.
Occasion of doubt.
So page first, criticism is that.
So everybody ready?
As an overview, the case, you probably shouldn't have conceded the argument that China and India are necessarily critical to be able to model the United States in a world where they don't model the United States. That means that we don't have terms of engagement for cyber warfare, which is inevitable in the status quo. You've conceded these arguments. That means that some securitization on some point is ultimately inevitable and good because we have to be able to securitize against the cyber attacks. Otherwise, if we don't have insecurity, if we are too vulnerable on that question, then that ultimately means that we're going to react too hard, and we're ultimately going to go to war with these individuals. That is going to be the framing question in today's debate, is whether or not we're able to solve for insecurity, which insecurity is ultimately inevitable, the conflict is ultimately inevitable. We have to be able to securitize against it to be able to solve back for it. You can go to the meltdown arguments. They say that economic collapse is ultimately died, but the argumentation is that the rate of cyber attacks is rapidly increasing, and that the vulnerability of the stock market is ultimately increasing as well, which means that as the future goes on, there's a higher increased propensity that economic collapse will ultimately happen. You say that we're moving away from nuclear, but our evidence indicates that we're necessarily moving more towards nuclear because it is an alternative energy that is very powerful. But additionally, you say that we're able to solve back to this with algae biofuels. Algae biofuels literally cost $200 a barrel, which is why the Navy isn't funding them anymore, where they actually still use CVNs, which is the nuclear-powered submarines, and aircraft carriers, an indication that nuclear is still sustainable and it's going to continue to be within the future because the federal government's investing in it. You say that mining creates runoff. That's exactly what happens in REMs, and whenever we pull out yttrium or neodymium, we have to be able to mine these things, and that causes runoff as well, which means that environmental collapse is ultimately inevitable at some point, which means that it's just try or die in terms of nuclear power. But this is the next argument. You said we can't solve for the environment without carbon negative technology. We specifically say that we would be able to invest in carbon negative technology because people are afraid of investing within the status quo that we're able to generate the carbon negative technology. It's almost as though nuclear power is a bridge fuel away from dirty fossil fuels, away to the green energy future. But this is the next argument. You say that the criticism is ultimately able to solve for terrorism better, but you're just being vulnerable. Terrorism is ultimately inevitable part of the world in today's debate, in the world, because of the way that the U.S. military, the way in which we have been framed in the past, which means that it is ultimately inevitable, that these terror attacks are inevitable. That is a question of how we are able to securitize against them so that we don't react too harshly. Anything else you want?
Diversifying energy means that the United States military doesn't demilitarise anymore. That's conceded.
Yeah, diversifying our energy means that the United States military is ultimately militarist anymore, which means that we're able to fall back for this. You can extend across the oil dependency arguments. This indicates that we're not going to have terrorism, but you can also extend across reasons why warming would necessarily lead to extinction. And you can also extend across the economic collapse as well as the bioterror scenarios. These are all instances of securitization that are going to be good. They're going to be disadvantages to the alternative at the point at which we're not securitizing and we just accept vulnerability. That is what allows for these things to be able to kill us.
200 nuclear power plants now means security is key. They don't answer the meltdowns impact, which means that you have to go down.
200 nuclear power plants now means that securitization is ultimately key. You've conceded these arguments that they're vulnerable from both physical and cyber attacks, which means that we have to have the standards of the affirmative in order to prevent total biosphere collapse.
Criticism?
The first is going to be that the role of the ballot is to endorse the policy option that saves the most lives. The role of the ballot is to endorse the policy option that saves the most lives. The second argument is going to be that consequentialism is ultimately good and inevitable. The first argument is that an evaluation of the cost-benefit analysis of a policy is the only ethical strategy in order to be able to determine its efficacy without it being able to ultimately just play with lives. The second argument is that only lives are ethical because anything else would necessarily superimpose value onto lives that are not necessarily ours. This is a form of ethical determinism. The third argument is going to be that life is ultimately a prior question. The first argument is going to be the no judgments on ethics. If we don't respond to environmental stimuli, i.e. we are fucking dead. The second argument is going to be that solving for human death is the only way that we can have productive change in the future, i.e. embrace insecurity in a world where we necessarily wouldn't be attacked, or we would die because of a nuclear meltdown. But the next argument is going to be that policy options are going to be good, that the state is ultimately inevitable, and able to securitize, that the hierarchies are created because we have a psychic desire for order. The second argument is going to be that making the state critical is critical for large-scale change within the future. But additionally, the next argument you say, rhetoric and violence argumentation, is that the PMC is representation of our rhetoric and the violence that we think will happen if our rhetoric is not endorsed, which means that you can wait on part with criticism. Bad policy arguments are silly.
What? Rhetoric doesn't shape policy. We don't securitize because we talk about securitize. We securitize because there are threats.
Yeah, we don't rhetoric doesn't shape securitization. We securitize necessarily because there are threats. And go to the links now. The first is going to be that you say securitization is vague, but argumentation is that securitization is good. We don't just make these broad claims that are just threat construction. Argumentation is that we have nuanced scenarios. Specifically, we're telling you that regional tensions that exist between India and Pakistan would necessarily go nuclear in a war with the United States is not a credible hegemon. We specifically tell you that Al-Qaeda and ISIS attacked in California, power plant and municipal utility, an indication that it's not just fear-mongering. But additionally, the next argument you say that we don't specify argumentation is that we specifically tell you that the majority of these attacks are coming from China, which means we have to be prepared against those, which is why we don't just declare outright war against them. We just want terms of engagement, which means that we can avoid these sort of large-scale conflicts in the future if we securitize a little bit now. But additionally, the next argument you said that we position us as oppositional, we're able to resolve this when we don't go to war with individuals because we don't respond too harshly. What would you say?
Rules of engagement are a form of vulnerability because they allow some conflict to take place, but under specific conditions.
Rules of engagement are a form of vulnerability because they allow for some sort of conflict to take place, but under terms and conditions. You go to the impacts. You say make militarism inevitable. Argumentation is that realism ultimately states that states are going to act in inherent self-interest and they're going to attempt to securitize in favor of their populations, which means that militarism on some sort of level is ultimately inevitable, which means we have to be able to approach that in the best methodology that would prevent broad militarization and things like a harsh response where we invade other countries. But additionally, the next argument, your unknown knowns and other is completely different from the world of the affirmative. That is literally the logic of invasion. That is imperialism. Ask yourself this question: is the affirmative an act of imperialism by securing our own fucking grids? We're not going to another country. But additionally, anything else you want there?
Just that if the unknown inside the that's fine.
You go to the permutation. The first is going to be permutation. Do the plan as an act of vulnerability. Do the plan as an act of vulnerability. The error of this is that the app is not necessarily what?
It's not necessarily going to work.
Yeah, it isn't necessarily going to work, but you should leave it open to the possibility that it will be able to protect people. The basic point is that the concept of mutual exclusivity means that security equals security logic because it presumes that there is a lifestyle that cannot exist with your own. This is a process that has been used to be able to create Islamophobia and oppression because it forms us versus them dichotomies. The second is going to be the voting negative. It doesn't embrace the vulnerability because it's giving a ballot. This is the commodification of the ballot. But the next argument is going to be that the app is a disadvantage of vulnerability because we have to be able to do the things that we talk about in order to be able to save the lives. But the next argument is that criticism would necessarily seem political and for allowing the broad right to be able to take over. They would ultimately do far worse atrocities because they would play upon the vulnerabilities and the fact that anybody else wasn't involved in the political.
If we just wanted to be vulnerable all the time, we'd let Donald Trump win the election.
Yeah, if we wanted to be vulnerable all the time, we'd just let Donald Trump win the election because he said some pretty popular shit. You go to the uniqueness arguments. Uniqueness is going to overwhelm the link for a couple of reasons. The first is that Iowa was Trump's second polling best state, which is an indication that if he lost that, he's probably not going to win the general. But the next argument is going to be that he's unelectable. This is what the vast majority of the individuals of the GOPers think now because 2/3 of them don't believe that he's electable. But additionally, the next argument is that 538 politics, as well as Real Clear, have him dropping within the New Hampshire primary and have Cruz and Rubio rising to take away the #1 spot from him. But additionally, your evidence is too predictive. It's way too far away. We still have 6 fucking candidates in the GOP race. You should be very skeptical of this story. They're probably going to try to do something slimy in the MO. Don't allow them to get away with it. But additionally, the next argument is going to be the link term that ultimately they would like securitization. You said that this is good for establishment. Our reputation is that the plan would ultimately be good because individuals like security. They like securitization because they don't want their grids to collapse, which means this actually gives the establishment a rallying cry to be able to resurge, and they're able to stonewall Trump and Cruz out of the race and allows for somebody like Rubio to take over. But additionally, the next argument you say anger against GOP because they give it to the Dems. If anything, this would just cause more people to move left because they're moderates in the status quo, and if the GOP is already giving it to the Democrats, it makes it look like their policy is inherently superior, which means the moderates actually move left. What?
Obama's been pushing cybersecurity since he got elected in 2008. This is a win for the Dems.
Yeah, Obama's been pushing cybersecurity since he got into office in 2008. This is a win for the Dems. But additionally, on the border of China, First off, there's not going to be a war trying because economic interdependence is ultimately going to go good job after this because we're too dependent on their economy. But additionally, the next argument is that you can say this would lead to an erase it. Oh, the next argument is going to be that the convention, they would just use the convention method in order to be able to circumvent Donald Trump's. They would just assign the superdelegates. They wouldn't let him have it just called outright in the convention. They would necessarily circumvent him to choose the establishment candidate.
Okay. Put this on top. In the critique, there'll be an overview on top of the critique. Then you can go to the case, probably, if I feel like it. It's a critique, so I'll probably do some, fucking overview-y shit when I get to the case. Go wherever. You good? On this extend the circumvention argument. This means there's no internal link. There's no ability for them to get off the link. So we're not going to this argument on security. As an overview, can I get a fucking warrant? They have no articulation of where these threats come from, who these threats are, or what the motivations behind these threats are. This is going to cause two things. One, it's going to be a link to our security argument. Our articulation is that yes, you identify that maybe India and Pakistan have a conflict, or maybe China will attack us. You don't identify why those actors want to attack us. Our argument is that you fundamentally have not proven that there is that threat. The second argument is that this is not only linked into the criticism, but also just disproves fundamentally your affirmative. All of your impacts are necessarily predicated upon the idea that there is a cyber attack. We are challenging the concept that cyber attack happens in the first place. Our argument is simply that you have simply invented the cyber attack as out of security logic. Our argument is that you make them prove to you a warrant where anywhere in the debate they tell you who wants to attack the United States and why. What's that?
So how about the reports that said Al Qaeda and ISIS both have surveyed United States grids, launched an attack against the grid inside California, that there have been attacks in the New York.
Hold on. Go ahead. That's our genealogy argument. Our argument is that your security analysis prevents us from having a genealogy of why those attacks occur in the first place. Our argument is that those reports are simply part of the security logic because they don't actually understand why those attacks happen. Our argument is that we are just undercutting the logic that creates your impacts in the first place.
So we didn't read a root cause impact, so we're security?
You don't have a question right now. Go ahead.
Okay. On the framework. Extend across the use of value representation. They can see a couple of arguments here. They're going in first, important first stand across. The argument that fiat is illusory means you don't get to extend any of your impacts in the debate because nothing besides what we say in this round it causes any actually goes anywhere, which means that none of your impacts are going to be flowable on the case. Additionally, I want you to extend across the argument that most of us not going to be policymakers means we only need portable skills means all of the arguments why policymaking is good are necessarily irrelevant because they are not skills that actually do anything. That you can extend across this analysis. The only portable skills we actually get are the rhetoric and the way that we think and relate to the world indicates that our criticism necessarily comes first. Additionally, I want you to send across the prior question argument the rhetoric shapes politics. They say this isn't necessarily true, but arguments you can send across an analysis about the Iraq War. The Bush created the Iraq War out of rhetoric of security. There's no actual proof that there was WMPs, but his rhetoric of the fact that these threats exist allowed him to construct the concept of WMP.
Congress and the people of the U.S. on it.
He had to sell Congress and the people of the U.S. on it in order to do this. Our argument is one, it's the reason our framework is good, but it's also an articulation of what we're saying your story is. You have simply invented a bunch of fucking threats without any actual analysis. Then they say the role of balance to have a policy option argument going to be a couple of things. First, that this is bad because it forces only policy debates which prevents us from actually interrogating the way that these policy options happen in the first place. You can send across our Bush analysis that says that if you evaluate this role of balance, we never actually get to articulating why it's happening, why we think insecurity in the first place means all of the impacts of the K are going to be impacts to the framework. Do you want anything else here?
Answer their line by line a little bit.
What do you want me to answer?
Specifically the argument about imposing value and consequentialism.
Oh, they say imposing value and consequentialism. Our argument is that first, consequentialism is bad because it's used to justify violence. We can always just point to this group of people and be like, oh, these people are kind of shitty and make my life awful and just destroy them under consequentialist framework. Our argument is that that's necessarily bad way to do it. What do you want me to say about this stuff?
People can have their own value life that they articulate, and you can weigh it based on how they articulate.
People can have their own value life based on how they articulate, and you can weigh it that way. All right. On the link level. Extend across our arguments that your logic and security, they necessarily concede Alex analysis that you don't do a genealogical understanding of why these threats happen in the first place. It means that I don't care how many fucking studies you can throw down on the table, you haven't articulated why these threats actually exist. Our argument is that all of your studies are framed within the same security logic because rather than actually attempting to figure out what the motives of actors are, they simply just point fingers and try and find people they can identify as threats. You can also extend our argument that you... Shit, I flow so bad. What's the second thing?
The second thing is the oppositional framework.
Additionally, extended across the oppositional framework argument arguments that you necessarily set up your firm to say us. Then you dichotomy this you have this argument that there are these cyber attackers out there that we need to securitize ourselves from. They don't actually link their only arguments that securitization is good. Argument is going to be that argument is going to be that if we win the thesis of our firm that you don't have this genealogical study, you don't have any articulation why we didn't need securitization in the first place. Additionally, we win argument that necessarily means securitization is bad. If we win the argument that you don't actually prove these threats exist, then securitizing them is one, unnecessary, and two, probably bad. They say that the rules of engagement create some form of vulnerability. This is not a response to our firm because the question: why would you do the rules of engagement in the first place? Additionally, rules of engagement are not what you're advocating means it's not any offense for you. On the epic level. The only argument they have here is realism. Argument is that realism is one, not inevitable, but also just not a good way of understanding the world. We have multiple historical examples. The first is that the Iran-Iraq war is not disparate realism. There's no theory in realism that could explain that war. It's purely an ideological war based on irrational hatreds of each other. Additionally, the war between Iraq and Kuwait. Additionally, this proves this realism. Iraq did not need any oil out of Kuwait, and Kuwait was a tiny state. There's no understanding of realism that actually creates a reason for Iraq to go to war. Additionally, the imposition of WMDs in Iraq and then the invasion of Iraq also disproves realism and proves our critique. There was no under realism. There's no rational reason we should have gone to Iraq other than the framing created through security. I want you to extend across this makes militarism inevitable arguments that whenever we securitize, we inevitably not only lash out against people we securitize, but also creates a self-fulfilling policy in which those people become threats because the more that we securitize against them, the more that they securitize against us to the point that they actually generate becoming threats, which means the two things. One is woo.
You got it?
What it means is that if we prove they don't have the internal link to the impact system that way, and additionally means we'll turn on all the impact because by articulating these cyber threats as existing, they actually make it possible for those cyber threats to exist in the first place because they give the supposed cyber terrorists a reason to attack us. This is the argument that Ali makes about how the terrorism was actually created through things like the Iraq war in the first place. Additionally. Additionally, what you said across that finger pointing leads to things like fascism because we can always securitize another and scapegoat someone which allows us to rally around a leader which makes wars more likely. On the alternative. They can see all the alternatives solved. They can see most of the alternatives solved. So you can send across Alex analysis that being vulnerable to allows us to resolve security because we no longer simply securitize the world, but sit there and state vulnerable. We accept the idea that the other is fundamentally not against us. Additionally, I want you, go to the perm. First argument is all the links are going to exist as the permutation as long as we win that you are engaging some forms of securitization. You necessarily cannot engage in vulnerability because you will always be protecting some form of other means securitization. Inevitably, it causes some form of militarism. Additionally, they say the security logic is bad because there's some sort of like lifestyle argument. Our argument is that one, we'd outweigh this because not a clearly articulated impact. Additionally, we'd say that the link to this doesn't make sense. We're not excluding your analysis. We're simply saying that analysis is bad.
Vulnerability isn't exclusion. It's taking it.
Vulnerability isn't exclusion. It's taking it back. Additionally, they say that we see the political arguments that the politicals already see the fact that we went to war in Iraq indicates that this form of rightness and security laws already exists means that this is not unique. Additionally, the last argument I probably need is they say states inevitable. That's irrelevant. It's only a question of how we relate to the state. We don't need to deconstruct the state in order to win this. Do they have anything else to need?
No.
All right, cool.
Go to
Like 15 seconds. Let's go.
It's cool.
No, it's fine.
Cool. Alright, it's going to be an overview. And yeah, basically pay in order. Alright, everyone good? What this comes down to is the framework on the criticism. That is going to be the primary question for how you evaluate the affirmative and how you evaluate the critique. And we believe that we're winning enough on the framework for us to just frame certain aspects and impacts of the affirmative out, which means that it'll just be a question of whether or not they win the impact turns on the criticism itself. Go to the framework proper. I think they have some pretty good line by line about policy debate being good and us being able to give certain forms of knowledge from this, but none of this is responsive to all of our articulation about portable skills in debate. You have straight conceded our actual line by line analysis, which indicates that you will not become policymakers and we will not become policymakers, but we will all go on to interact with other people and use certain forms of rhetoric which have certain implications to them, which means the question of the 1AC is irrelevant. It's just a question of whether or not they win the impact turns on the criticism itself and whether or not securitization is a good thing or not. We say that the knowledge that we would gain from winning the 1AC in the first place is absolutely not useful on the meta level of debate, probably indicates this is not crucial, but in addition to this, we say it trades off with our ability to understand these violences which are more proximal. You can see a proximal impact frame, which probably indicates that we're ahead on this. They're going to go hard on this consequentialism and util argument. The first argument that you're going to want on this, John's argument that consequentialism is bad because it just allows justify the purging of certain populations because of this, but addition to this fact that there's no not necessarily an imposing of value to life when we take subjectivity into account. We can listen to people's own subjective self-reporting of their value to life and analyze it. People are pretty vocal about why they like to be alive in a lot of instances. Probably indicates that your disads to other forms of weighing are going to be non-unique. This means that you can't weigh the affirmative against the criticism because policy debate simply on the meta debate level is bad, but also re-articulates our ability to actually have discursive discussions, which means to question the links. The first argument on the links is always going to be whether or not you actually identify these states. They're going to say that they name certain states, but this is not the argument. The argument is about your conflation of those states with this other, which we were scared of in the first place. Our argument is that your inability to actually articulate the motivations for those states means that their names are just empty signifiers for some other who is always encroaching on us and some threat which is always going to be able to try to lead us towards extermination. You can see in our argument about the unknown unknowns being a similar example of this. The unknown unknowns, we were able to say these are weapons of mass destruction, but knowing the actual materiality and the reality behind them was a separate question from this, which means the philosophical framing and the rhetorical framing of these countries is always going to be a prior question on how we view them. And in addition to this, you can go to the second link about oppositional frameworks. Your understanding of these countries, which we need to act reactively to, rather than solving the root cause, is always going to be crucial. You can see the argument that the affirmative can never get to the root cause of terror in the first place, or the root cause of war. You say you're able to check back for it with things like realism, but the argument here specifically is as long as we are always reactive, we can never understand those motivations, which means realism fails because it assumes we can understand the rationality of other countries. But you can see our serial policy failure arguments under this link, which indicate that you would never be able to get that, which means that always the alternative alone is the prior question. That means it's a question of the impacts. We are going to be winning on the militarization level, that this is always going to lead to extinction. You can see the argument specifically that the line on who gets securitized and their fingers pointed at can always be moved infinitely, which means that this is always the internal links on the side. That means on magnitude, you should just favor the criticism over the affirmative in the first place, which means that you should evaluate the magnitude over probability. But in addition to this, we would also just say that our argument about being able to purge a genocide population is always going to be an important question, a probable question that we should debate in this round. They're going to go hard for these realism good arguments, but we are simply going to win that there are some things realism can't account for, and sometimes realism cannot account for the motivations of states that are irrational. But in addition to this, we have also just conceded the argument that we can't properly understand rationality in a world of serial policy failure when you can't give a genealogical account of why actors act in the first place. Probably indicates that you would never be able to resolve this onto the permutation question. They're going to say you can do the app as an act of vulnerability, but argument is always going to be that this is never going to be enough in a world where there are epistemological links to the way that the app actions. You have already framed the rhetoric of the affirmative in an oppositional way, which means that it can never be vulnerable. This is John's dissad to the permutation, which probably indicates that you go for the alternative low just on magnitude level and the ability to check back for homicide. But they're going to make the argument also that we engage in forms of Islamophobia because we exclude certain forms of action. John's action argument here is just correct. The vulnerability is not actually a form of exclusion. It is actually stepping back. Probably indicates that we are ahead on that debate, which means that the alternative alone is going to be able to resolve all these things. You can see that the alt would solve the K and that the alt would solve the affirmative by actually getting to the root cause of where these wars come from in the first place, and the need for securitization probably indicates that on a probability and magnitude level, you're voting just for the alternative alone. Links are too high for risk, and we framed out the AF. The order will be an overview, and then the AF, and then the K in order of frameworks, links, impact. So everybody ready?
Alexander Wars, too little too late. You consider massive portions of the affirmative that provide your genealogy. Your thesis of the 2 and C just summarily becomes you didn't explain it enough because you didn't provide a genealogy of how, when, why, where it happens. Yet you also concede all the warrants on the affirmative as to why these things happen in the first place. Drop down to our impact. So what you're sitting across indicates that there are 200 PowerPoints that are vulnerable inside the United States because they don't have cybersecurity standards that indicates that there were people who attack it because of A, military reports have indicated that Al Qaeda and ISIS have a specific they are looking for specific vulnerabilities inside the United States in order to be able to attack them. The reason that this is because the United States invaded the Middle East in order to get access to oil. That is the terrorism scenario that we read at the bottom, that we solve militarism by diversifying energy inside the United States. That means we don't have to invade the Middle East anymore. Solves back for the entirety of the criticism, goes 100% conceding the block. You should hold their framework arguments to extremely high threshold for being framing out of our impact. If we went a single reason why you should evaluate the app, then you should evaluate this as a clean link turn to their position, especially if we win that rhetoric doesn't shape reality. Seeded extinction scenarios, resulting meltdowns, cascades across the globe and kills off all agriculture. Uniquely different than Fukushima because there's so many of them all consolidated in one place. Okay. Framework fourth argument, you conceded that we have a psychic desire for order, which means that securitization is inevitable. This means you should heavily frame out all of their dissents to the permutation as being terminally not unique, because if we are constantly trying to organize society in a particular way against threats, that means that there will always be some form of securitization, but ours is uniquely better than the way in which they attempt to find the affirmative. We have specifically identified that there is a genealogy of warrants as to why our impact must take place, but some amount of preemption is absolutely critical to be able to prepare for threats that actually exist. Now, what our role in the battle that you should interact the policy option that saves the most lives. You had ignored the fundamental claim about what consequentialism is inevitable and good, that first, you don't vote for something just because they have an advocacy. You vote for something because there is a cost that it simply cannot be avoided. There's a benefit to voting for the plan, but also you shouldn't evaluate value of life impacts because it's ethical self-determination to say that other people don't have value of life for them. It's an indication that you should only evaluate lives in this debate. That means it's our extinction versus their extinction, and they have literally no scenario for how that happens. Link debate. I want you to study across the fourth argument that Stephen makes indicates that rules of engagement are not a form of oppositional securitization, but rather something that allows for some conditions of conflict to take place, but still allows us to be vulnerable. Your only argument is that is not what you advocate, yet the plan results in that is conceded, means that there is some allowance of vulnerability that is sufficient to link to your arguments, because the thesis of the UNC and the LOR is literally just you don't tell us what these impacts are, and that means that it's unknown, and the other is then conflated this way, but we have literally identified there are two groups who want to attack the United States. ISIS and Al-Qaeda is an indication that you have to securitize via providing frameworks to engage by like standards of what cybersecurity ought to be there. Yeah.
That question's the solvency, because then what do we just have to think about it for 10 minutes?
Yeah, literally, this means the alt can never solve any portion of the affirmative because they literally cannot securitize against anything, means there's no preemption like cybersecurity standards, so we literally all die. You've also conceded that death has to be evaluated because if we don't respond to external stimuli, i.e. we are dead, that means we can't consider things like vulnerability turns, the entirety of the criticism, and if we're winning any kind of consequentialism, then you vote affirmative. Now, the impact debate. No good warrant in the block as to why they are the root cause of security. You can cross-apply our argument for framework that indicates that rhetoric doesn't shape security, that is a response to actual threats that exist, which is the premise of realism, that there are real things that really happen and you have to take them into account, is an indication that you should evaluate their first. The only example they provide of rhetoric being able to cause war is the Iraq War, which was directly justified by Bush as a result of 9/11 and actual terrorist attack that took place, is an indication that the 2&C is too little too late on that question. Perm debate. I want the permutation functionally because you can see both the solvency arguments is why it works. The ace point is the app might not work. It might not prevent anything, which means that the app is a functional leap of faith by advocating for the permutation, because if it doesn't prevent all these things, then you have at least opened yourself up to the possibility that it could. Now, the piece of point that he says is really important. The concept of mutual exclusivity is an us-them dichotomy that allows them to point fingers at us and say, you are the enemy because you securitize, which is in itself an act of securitization, and then your response to us attempting to accede to your demands for vulnerability is to kick us out and say that you can't have the permutation because you already securitize. This is the same kind of logic that prevents all kinds of international relations negotiations, an indication that you should heavily preface the permutation against the dissent of the alternative. Their dissent of the alternative is just an extension of the link. There's not a unique reason why voting for a vulnerable affirmative that still does an act of vulnerability via some amount of preemption also solves the app and solves all of the criticism. Now, you said the political has already been ceded. The affirmative is a reclamation of that because we prevent the United States from having the justification that they have to go to the Middle East for oil because the energy market is so diversified that everybody knows that it's not true. And also, their answer to the state inevitable argument is just that it's not, might not be inevitable. No warrants in this argument hold the block to a high threshold on warrants.